Hello, everybody. My name is Sil, the DM, and welcome for a quick, hopefully quick, campaign recap for my D&D 5th edition campaign, The City. For the week of November the 8th, I think was the session date. I'm not going to be having a script for this one. Uh, this session is titled The Mayor and the City. So, after successfully protecting Grulak Thren in his work to create a pair of adamantine swords, uh, the party were taking a moment to rest and almost rejoiced that the swords were finished, and that hopefully this meant they would be able to get to the mayor and help. At which point, Sin, the Archfiend, broke the barrier that the mayor had in place. Grulak, in his wounded state, was in no way to carry the blades himself, tossed them to the players, which Zahn quickly picked up, and the group as a whole ran off towards the judicial building, which is the center of power for the city. Not just being the largest building in the city, but like the very center focal point. Zahn, a local to the city, having been raised here for most of his life, had a good idea of what streets and back roads they could take to get there the fastest, and it sort of became a mad dash, with everyone starting to get pretty exhausted from the amount of sprinting they were doing. Along the way, a few of them noticed they had just pulled out in front of a large group of 20 orcs and maybe 5 dark elves. Um, and as those three prepared to draw their weapons, while the others hadn't noticed because of how fast they were running, the whole squadron of enemy troops was suddenly assaulted uh, from a nearby building, where they quickly discovered that a group of goblins and an Oread had taken shelter inside the building. Several of the players who noticed this recognized the figure. These were the highwaymen who sort of controlled the pass between the Twin Mountains to the south. South of the city, there are two large mountains that bisect the area between the city and the Great Forest. The road, which leads south of the city, the Great Imperial Highway, goes up through these mountains, through a plateau, as crossing the open, hilly terrain between the city and the forest can often be quite dangerous of creatures coming out of the forest. Such creatures stay out of the mountains, however. Um, and they had met this highwayman before, an Oread by the name of Paddock Griff, who was a smooth-talking criminal who didn't like hurting people, but wasn't above doing what he needed to do to get his pay. And a large, almost looks like tribe of goblins who worked with him. Uh, they seem to have distracted the orc and drow pretty heavily, as becoming suddenly bombarded with arrows and rocks and projectiles from a nearby building, easily cutting into their numbers heavily right away, distracted them from the running group down the street. Proceeding on, the group passed through several more alleys and corners, getting onto the main thoroughfare straight to the judicial building, and they could feel the ground begin to shake and quake. And as they ran past, in the center of the street, there was a lone figure surrounded by bodies. I believe the account at a quick glance was somewhere around 30 orcs and probably half a dozen dark elves. And standing in the middle of this carnage, completely drenched in blood and breathing heavily like a haggard animal pushed to exhaustion, the group noticed Sindaria, the elven secretary of the judicial building and the mayor's friend and a member of the city's council. A heavy-set, overweight elf who wore long robes of a soft white trimmed with gold and fabric, and in his hands was a massive two-headed battle axe, which looked like it had been silvered. It's a beautiful weapon that the group had noticed before, usually rested on a mantle behind Sindaria's desk. Uh, unable to stop to worry about the heavily wounded elf who didn't even really respond to their approach. It looked at them, but in its blood rage recognized them as not an enemy and let them pass. And as they approached the area of the judicial building, it began to collapse, and the road began to fill with dust and ash, and the whole ground began to heave. And the area that is the judicial building, which we discovered has a diameter as a building of about 3 miles long, it's very big, began to sink into the ground. And by the time they managed to get to the edge, it had sunken down 15 feet, and the rubble a clattered mess of ruin. And then Darling and the mayor were there. Darling being a fairy, a very rare type of fey creature. That in this setting, as far as any of the players know, there were only 3 fairies in existence still. 3 pixies, as it were. And the mayor was there. And they informed the mayor that they had acquired the swords and they were ready to perform the ritual. And the mayor was happy at this and shared with them knowledge of the arcane sigils that they would need to create. Um, Basically, sharing and telepathically linking the players and presenting this massive arcane circle, this magic circle that they needed to create. And Darling, using his fey magic, began popping out large, two-handed paintbrushes that he explained were enchanted to never run out of ink, something they could use to paint this sigil on the ground. And while they were getting this sort of rundown and starting to strategize who would paint what part of the sigil, the ground buckled again, and the mayor, who had again resumed looking out over the pit that was forming in the center of his city, knew that Sin's spirit had now reconnected with its body. And there was a large sense of apprehension in the man, especially given the fact that Sin and the mayor are clearly on different levels. As the players who have a decent understanding of local history know that 200 years ago, when the city was founded, the Archfiend Sin was defeated, as far as the legends go, by this figure, the mayor. Uh, 2 armies and an entire adventuring party of companions who were all very skilled. But now the mayor would be staring down this archfiend with just Darling, his partner, while the players desperately tried to perform the ritual that would allow them to trap Sin within one of the blades. Um, and he had a moment where he looked out over the ruin of the judicial building and around all the parts of his city that were burning, the sounds of battle. And he offered a sad smile to the group and just said, I really liked that building, you know? But they knew he meant much more than that. Using a bit of divine magic and uttering a soft prayer, the mayor cleared the debris of the judicial building, teleporting the mass that was within this new pit to a different part of the city, which the group heard reappear and crash several blocks away, which they found rather funny. But the mayor, as strong as he is, can't just delete a building of that size. Transposing it is something he could manage barely in very short distance. But he wanted to give them as smooth a floor to do their work on as possible. And it was at this point that Sin began to claw his way out of the ground, his body seeming frail and weak, as if it had atrophied for 200 years of disuse, just rotting underground inside its prison, which, to be fair, definitely made Sin weak as the party looked at him. They understood that the Archfiend was not at full power, but he was still twice the size of the mayor. The mayor of which shed his skin and assumed his true form as a Trumpet Archon. Green skin, golden eyes, with a white toga, It's braided with this beautiful gold twine that looks like it might almost be horsehair. Three sets of wings dot his back, and in his hand was a brilliant ram's horn that's reached out the length of an ordinary person. It was the first time most of the party had ever seen this form, and Kovalin, who is a celestial summoner, a celestial portal summoner, was very awestruck by this, recognizing him as a Trumpet Archon. As Sin pulled his way up and Darling came to approach him and whipped out his little bow, the mayor pulled his horn to his lips, and with this single pristine sound blasted out a clarion, a threat, and just this deafening clarion that just ricocheted out throughout over miles of distance. And the players all felt their bodies get filled with this divine energy. A paltry amount of temporary hit points. I believe each ended up with about 15 or 12. I don't remember. It was somewhere around there. But they also knew that the celestial power coursing through their bodies would give them protection from exhaustion. At which point, Sin, the mayor, and Darling began to clash in the center of this 3-mile wide pit. And the players dove into the pit and began doing their painting. And this fight went on for almost the entire session, so I don't have the detailed notes to recap it bit by bit. And in fact, that would get pretty tedious very quickly, because though I described what was going on and made each round as entertaining as I could, this, quote, boss fight, unquote, was my players working together to try and paint this arcane sigil and avoid the fight going on between Sin and the mayor as much as possible. Because if they went on too long and took too long to do it, odds are the mayor would lose the fight and Sin would just not ever enter the circle, and they wouldn't have anything else to trap with it even if he did. Or they might end up getting caught in the fight and just dying in the process. So it was kind of a race against time. And how we did it was through a series of performance checks. And I would allow situational bonuses based on what people were doing, and situational penalties. Now, of course, none of them were feeling the exhaustion thanks to the mayor's beautiful horn sound, which, by the way, turns into a massive silvered broadsword that he fights with. So the players began to do this, and it was going okay. The players took a fair bit of damage from rubble, debris. At one point, Sin's blood got hurled towards them, which is like a thick magma-like sludge. And more than once, several of them took really large hits from just debris of the battlefield. At one point, Siren, who had been performing pretty poorly through the whole first part of this challenge, getting almost nothing done in the first 3 rounds, while everyone else was explosively getting parts of the circle painted. He ended up getting cut by one of the teeth of Sin that the mayor punched out of his face. It was pretty touch and go there at some points, though. Especially when people started losing their temporary hit points and began feeling the effects of exhaustion. Zahn in particular was consistently managing to land natural 20s, which, though it was allowing Zahn to paint much more than they should normally be able to paint in a round, it was also clear that it was extremely exhausting the monk, and it was this adrenaline high from the celestial magic that was allowing him to perform the way he was. And he could feel that scar ripping down his legs as pushing his body seemed to aggravate it. And during all of this, the fight between Sin and the mayor kept getting harder and harder. And at one point, Sin noticed the group, and not knowing what they were doing, noticed they were doing something. I know at one point Kovalin took a turn to summon a little living light, a sort of celestial elemental, to heal the mayor. And it did for about 7 points of damage before it was immediately snuffed out by this aura of hellfire, a mixture of necrotic and flame damage that radiates off of Sin. Um, they also came very close to just getting blasted with his breath weapon, a 120-foot cone of hellfire. This magenta red roaring fire outlined in black that deals necrotic and fire damage. And they were saved at the last moment by Darling. It was very clear during the early part of the fight that the mayor had the advantage. Sin wasn't really used to being in his body anymore. After 200 years of atrophy, the physical form he was in possession of was weakened and not behaving correctly, basically. And the mayor and Darling used the most of this early advantage, stopping to heal only when they were pushed to near their limit. But getting closer towards the end of the fight. And I was rolling for this to determine how the fight would go each round. And the whole team wouldn't go each round. It was basically 3 people would paint, and then something would happen in the fight to sort of represent legendary actions and how both of these NPCs are sort of just ignoring the round limit because both of them basically had legendary actions and we're just using them on each other constantly. It was like a fight between 2 legendary boss monsters. So whenever one of them does something, the other one does something, and they're doing it whenever the group is painting, basically. So we basically did where 3 people would roll to paint, and I would explain what they were doing and how it was going, and we would mark their progress on a chart, showing like me coloring the circle as they go, and then something would happen in the fight with the mayor and Sin. And it started going pretty poorly for the mayor and Darling. Darling was severely hurt. The mayor was getting pretty close to broken. They'd blown through the best of their spells and most of their healing. But the group was also just about to finish the circle. And Sin, knowing that the mayor was weak and that Darling was weakened, decided to take the time to stop the party, and he started approaching them. At which point, the mayor and Darling together tried to push him back. The mayor was holding him off a little bit, slowing him down, preventing the hellfire from reaching the players, just barely, because of how far, like, the part of the circle they were working on was further back from the fight. It was the last few sections to finish. But the mayor began to give ground, and Darling flew in to help, and they watched as Darling's rainbow gossamer wings, those beautiful fey butterfly wings, began to burn and melt away in the fury of the hellfire aura of Sin, as Darling was rapidly approaching his last leg. They had a single burst of motion as Darling went down, where the mayor let Sin overpower him for a moment and throw himself off balance and then give him a blast back. And as he chased in after him, Darling collapsed at the edge of the magic circle. Shit, how do I go back? There we go. My bad. Hand talking, I smacked the keyboard. However, Sin once again regained his balance and blasted the mayor back next to Darling. And began rushing in, at which point Carvelin sent Basiri to protect Darling, coiling around its snake-like eidolon to protect the small Pixie. And Carvelin watched as everyone fled out of the 180 or 120, 180 foot wide, like, diameter magic circle they had been painting. They all fled out now that it had finished. And Carvelin watched as Basiri, their beloved eidolon, melted away in the hellfire. Skin, then tendons and muscles, then bone, till it just in ash. However, it did protect Darling quite a bit. The group doesn't know if Darling is alive or not, but that protection definitely helped. And as Sin was looming over, looking at them, getting ready to kill them and not cross over this obvious trap they had made for him, the mayor pulled what little bit of energy he had, grabbed Sin by the front, and pulled him into the circle. At which point, Reichiji, the spirit, the soul that is inside Midnight's dagger, cast the ritual, and he'd been preparing it this whole time. And this beautiful rainbow barrier began shooting up, multiple lights from the inner circles of the magic ring, and they poured over the two figures like a prison. And Sin was thrashing, trying to break out, but couldn't. And the mayor was holding him in, and just this grim smile on his face, his green skin marred with his purple blood. And then, with a great release and a surge of rainbow light, the two were gone, and the swords that Zahn had dropped in the center of the circle had warped and changed as they become the host of these two beings. One sword had taken on almost a silver-like sheen, its handle becoming gold-colored and wavy, the pommel a lion's mane in mid-roar. The other became short and fat and black, its pommel these four claws reaching, its handguard, sorry, these four long prongs reaching up like spikes, and the pommel this grasping claw that was holding this dark red ruby. Now, during the fight, some other cool things had happened. At one point, the mayor was launched towards the party, and they needed to make a reflex save to avoid getting hit by him. And Zahn expended a lot of their effort and a lot of their hit points to catch the mayor as a monk to deflect missile and used a key point to throw the mayor back at Sin. Also, at one point, there was this Sin summoned up a storm of red lightning, and it ended up striking Midnight, dropping him unconscious. There was a lot of interesting moments, but in the end, they succeeded. Exhausted, several of them near death, barely holding on to life, the group thought that they could rest for a moment and try and recover the blades, and at that point they discovered that none of them could move. And this sound, like static, rang out through their ears, and a weight fell upon them, like gravity was suddenly dialed high. And all but Rickle fell unconscious. Rickle and Coop. Discovering that they couldn't move, Coop and Rickle discovered that this very thin webbing, like string, was strung around them, preventing their bodies from moving. At which point, the scar that had been forming along Coop's body, that had been there for a very long time but had been growing rapidly recently, exploded. And a figure crawled out of Coop's, or Zahn, sorry, I keep calling Zahn Coop, which is the player's name. My bad. A figure pulled its way out of Zahn's body. A tall, unearthingly beautiful dark elf woman with ass-length white hair, just platinum white. And as she turned to look at Zahn, they realized that her eyes were not like normal eyes. They were black like starlight and the void. And where an iris or pupil would be, she instead had these brilliant neon pink spider webs, like violet energy throughout her eyes. And she spoke to Zahn as Rickle watched on, unable to speak because of the tight webbing and the exhaustion in his body. This figure spoke to Zahn and thanked him for being such a good son, apologized for the damage it took, explained a little bit of why it needed to happen this way, that it would be easier for her to get here this way, using Zahn as a conduit. But that Zahn had done admirably, and the figure revealed that it had been the one that had protected the egg, not Callias, which was who Zahn had been praying to when burying the egg in the sand. Um, and the figure, as Zahn's wounds began to seal, not heal so much as just seal, the figure walked away from the two of them, bent down and picked up the swords, before ripping a tear in the sky, revealing a different plane, this visual static, a world of black and gray breaking through white, colors bleeding into the static. And there, both of them caught a glimpse of an old man, a human, it looked like, with white and blue hair and a scraggly beard of white and black, and white clothes, almost like a robe or a work jacket, almost like a lab coat, um, chained to some sort of pillar beyond, with wild, crazed eyes. And this woman, this dark elf looking woman, who when she moved, her feet didn't make impact on the ground, but all around her, on either side, four large indents began to form, as if she was actually some titanic spider, merely appearing in the form of a woman. She informs on that she could consider her father's debt, his father's debt paid. And then she walked into the portal, and it closed behind her, and everyone passed out. At which point, the players all experienced very different visions, depending on what sort of things are happening in the world that they're related to in some way, or moments of their past that have some significance. Each one experiencing them alone as they healed. Uh, Midnight experienced a lot about Alistair, or Astor, the drow man who had taken him in with the circus, and that symbol of the playing card in his mind. Rickle saw a moment of a path, a choice to make, a fork in the road. The path he was on, which was dark and lonely, or another path blazoned with the spear of Jericho. And he chose the path alone and left after waking up from his illness, recovering from his wounds, as it were. And a few other people experienced odd dreams. Kovlin looked desperately for Basiri, their eidolon, eventually finding a glimpse of it beyond this dark, pale wall that incited very deep feelings of fear and terror. But pushing through, they discovered this beautiful valley surrounded by snow-topped mountains, and Basiri sitting with an old man dressed in gray, with soft blue eyes and a long white beard. And they were reunited, and that's when Kovalen woke up as well. Dar'xel had a vision of Ohm, the halfling crime boss, who was interrogating him vaguely about things Dar'xel really couldn't grasp, and there was something odd about what was going on. Eventually, however, he noticed that there was something wrong with the halfling's eyes, that they were black and filled with golden hourglasses instead of what the halfling's eyes actually look like. At which point a woman dressed in gray robes came out and apologized for her husband, and sat with Dar'xel for a moment. They spoke, and she offered him her hand, which, after a moment of hesitation, he took. And when he woke, he noticed a change on his body. One of his tattoos was very different. Across his midsection, there was this very detailed tattoo of a raven. Zahn experienced a lot the moments of their father. The little moments they remember, running with him, fleeing with him, falling and getting that scar. The vague memories of their life before where they are now. And eventually, all these memories and this feeling of their family and friends, they became surrounded on either side. One with this great symbol of a wolf, and the other with this giant spider. Beyond this, Siren had a vision of his home, under siege by great frost giants, and two wolves spoke to him, inciting in him that he might need to come and protect this place someday, and he needed to decide if he was part of the pact or not, at which point he realized that between the two wolves was a man, an elf, it looked like, who he recognized as being the Wolf Lord, a beast lord, a sort of deity in this setting. And he agreed that he would protect his home and his family, and that he would come if called by the pack. Beyond this, Levi also experienced a bit of a dream, being visited by three Yuntai gods and the great dragon that they had met earlier in the campaign. And though she was afraid, her deity, Glimmerwing, the fairy dragon, king of the fey dragons, joined her, and she felt confident, a surge of energy, and an understanding that she was not alone, and that her friends were with her, and that when the time came, she would figure out what to do. And gradually, everyone woke up from their wounds. In a very quiet room, their beds separated by curtains of cloth. They were heavily bandaged and barely able to think, let alone move. Nurses would come in red outfits, little brown capes that fell about their elbows. They would feed them and give them water, and slowly the group felt their strength return. It was at this point that Ohm, that halfling, came and informed them that they'd been out unconscious or barely conscious for 3 weeks, and that it had taken as much magic as they could muster to heal them and keep them alive and fed. And he wanted to know what happened. And that's where we ended the session. So when we come back up next time, we'll be very interested to see what players are willing to talk about and what things they saw or what things they know they're going to share. I hope everyone had a fun time listening. I'm sorry that this didn't have a script to read along with, and it was more vague than what I've been doing recently. But it was a long session of a very specific event, and breaking it down turn by turn would take a very long time. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe, or share with your friends. I love making stuff like this, and I love talking D&D. If you have any questions about one of my campaigns, I'll be happy to help as long as it's not spoiling something for the players. Please, have a great day.